Okay, I am happy to be here with my friend Pam Barnhill. Um, Pam is an award-winning educator, a former journalist. Now she is a homeschool mom. And one of the things I love about Pam is she's great at something I'm not so good at. And that is taking big, overwhelming tasks and breaking them down into small, manageable steps. Most of us need help with that. Pam's good at it. And she's the author and of or should I say, host of a podcast called Your Morning Basket. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about that today, along with our topic. Today, we are talking about books and lots of different things about using books, finding good books, those sorts of things in your homeschool. So, Pam, is there anything you want to tell us about yourself real quick before we get started with our questions?
No, I think you just about covered it. Thanks so much for having me here.
Well, I'm excited. We haven't seen each other in so long because of the homeschool conferences not going on this year. So
yeah, it's been sad not to get to see you guys this year.
I know, it has been. Okay, well, we're going to jump right into our topic so that we don't keep everybody too long. We're all busy moms. A lot of us have young kids, some have older kids. So we're going to try to jump right into this topic and see what we can learn. So first, why do you think that books are such an important thing to have as part of homeschooling? Why do we need books in our homeschools?
Well, Wendy, the coolest thing about books is that they really allow you to get kids in touch with the great teachers of the world. One of the things we hear from homeschool parents, new homeschool parents, especially a lot of times, is I'm not sure I can teach my kid, or I don't know enough about a subject to teach my child. And so they worry about that. But that's where books are absolutely fabulous, because the people who wrote those books, especially when we use living books, we use books written by one author who had a passion about what they were writing about. Those people do know their subject very well. They were very passionate about it, and they want to share that information with the reader of those books. And so by teaching our kids how to read, teaching our kids how to dig deep into these kind of living books, we can put them in touch with fabulous teachers and wonderful ideas that go way beyond the, just kind of the barriers of the walls of our house.
Right. It sort of takes some of that burden off of us. I know a lot of new or potential homeschooling families just think, I don't know enough about all these topics to teach my kids about all these things. And so what you're saying is we don't have to know all about these topics. We can consult with people who do through their books.
That is exactly right.
You mentioned living books. So for the parent who doesn't know what that means, can you just explain to us a little bit about what a living book actually is?
So a living book is a book typically written, it's not a textbook, for one thing. So this is not a book, when you think about textbooks are a lot of times written by a committee of people. And, there's an agenda there to get information over to the students. And, they kind of voted on what got put in and what didn't get put in and how this stuff would be presented. And it's all these little chunks and bits of information. And I'm not saying textbooks don't have a purpose, but a living book is a book written by one author who typically, and I will caveat this with some homeschool things that we look at as textbooks are actually more living books. So let me use like Life of Fred as an example. So Life of Fred, a lot of people would look at that and say, well, this is a math textbook, because it does kind of present itself that way. But it was actually written by one author, and it was somebody who was pretty passionate about sharing those math ideas with students. And so I wouldn't consider that necessarily a textbook. I would consider Life of Fred a living book. So in homeschooling, like look at the Elementary Apologia series by Jeannie Fulbright. Yeah. That's another one where one author, she has a passion, she's sharing this in a literary form with students, but then also books like we have one called Hurry and the Monarch, which is a little picture book of a little turtle who meets a monarch butterfly. And in that book, you learn all about the migratory patterns of monarchs. Whereas if you were reading about it in a textbook, it might be like a little paragraph like this, but instead there's this entire picture book where this little turtle meets the monarch. You learn so much about monarchs and their migratory patterns. And it's just so much more enjoyable way to learn it than the like one paragraph factual, bit of information that you would find in a textbook. Did
Right,
that help?
right. Yes, yes, that's perfect. One thing too that I always kept in mind, especially when my kids were younger, is the living books really do what it sounds like they do. They make the topic come alive instead
They
of
do.
reading this boring, like you're saying, just a paragraph or two or just facts. They really make it's sort of a um, almost a you are there experiencing whatever it is that's happening.
Yeah.
So
And can I say something about picture books for a few minutes?
yes, please do.
Okay, because I hate to get off on a tangent, but I want to talk about picture books for a
No,
minute.
please do. We have a lot of younger kids, a lot of parents of younger kids who are starting to homeschool now. I think that's great.
Well, and I want to talk about picture books too, not just for younger kids, but also for kids who are like in fourth, fifth, sixth grade, something like that. And you think, oh, I've got to start making the shift and
Mm,
moving to novels or readers for those age kids. And actually, picture books are written to be read aloud to a child. And so you've got your first picture books, especially those little board book forms where you have lots of rhyme and repetition. And those are actually important linguistic skills. But then you start getting into these meatier picture books that were written to be read aloud to a child. So picture books are often written at a higher reading level than even those first novels that kids read, and they include so much information. So I would just really encourage moms, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh graders, not to eschew those picture books and push them aside, but use them in your homeschool because there's some really great information in there that is presented in an enjoyable way that you can read aloud to your child. It's going to elevate their language, and it's just going to be a better, more interesting way to get information about the Revolutionary War, or planting a garden, or naturalists. There are so many great picture books out there about like scientists and things like that. So just don't push those aside. I just had to say that.
well, I'm glad you did. I'm really glad you did. And one of the things that I really like about not only reading picture books to your kids, but even reading novels and things like that as your kids do get older is I really feel like parents need to keep in mind that our kids can understand on a much higher reading level than they are capable of reading. So
Yes.
don't be afraid to read books to your kids that have a much higher reading level. Your kids will understand it better when they hear you reading the sentences and saying those words. And if they don't understand something you're saying to them, let them know it's okay to stop you and say, well, what does that word mean? I don't understand. Or what is that sentence or that paragraph talking about? We need to be willing to stop and have those conversations, because that really improves our kids' reading so much when they hear us read and introduce new vocabulary and things like that.
Yeah, a great talk about this is Andrew Pudewa's Nurturing Competent Communicators. It's one of my absolutely favorite talks, and you can find it free on the IEW website. And one of the things that he talks about in there is, so often as we learn to read and we read silently, we read in chunks. We don't read every single word. And one of the most important things for us are these sophisticated, reliably correct language patterns. And the only way to get those is to read every single word. This makes our writing more sophisticated, makes us better writers. And so because kids, like adults, are reading in these chunks and they're not getting all those language patterns, the only way to get those language patterns to the kids is for them to hear people read aloud. And so that's why it's important to keep reading aloud to kids even long after they can read themselves. And
Right.
yes, those higher level books. So yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I read, you probably did too. I read to my kids, read out loud to them every single day until they honestly, until they got old enough to have jobs, 15, 16, 17 years old,
I
and they
still
just
read
weren't
out
home.
loud. Yeah.
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 So,
I still read. I have a whole stack of books over here in my homeschool planning stack. I'm reading out loud to the kids this year. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I love it. It's a great way to spend time and develop those relationships with your kids too. And that's part of the reason we have them home with us. So I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
great. Okay, so can you tell us some different ways to use books in our homeschools? Maybe some things we haven't thought about. We talked a little bit about reading aloud. So what else can we do with books in our homeschools?
Well, definitely the reading aloud. And we do most of ours during our morning basket time. During our school day. So, this is a time when the entire family is together, and listening to those read alouds is an incredibly efficient use of time to do that. Other things you can do with books in your homeschool is you can strew them. So think about different books having different purposes. So we were talking about some of those living books that are great to read aloud, but there are some really fun books that really kind of stink to read aloud. So I'm looking at you, Magic School Bus books, Miss Frizzle, the ones I'm talking about, Wendy, right?
Yes, yes.
So these are fun books. Kids love these books. But if you've ever tried to read one aloud, I would just as soon take a fork to my eyeball than have to do that, because but my kids, there was the Mrs. Frizzle history series as well, where she goes to like ancient Egypt and she's in a castle. They
Right.
loved them. I hated reading them. And so those are the kinds of books you strew. Though,
Yep.
some of the DK books with the beautiful pictures in them,
Mm-hmm.
but they just don't read well.
Yeah.
So strewing is another thing you could do with your books in your homeschool. So you can read aloud, you could strew, and then of course you're going to want to have your children read. And when you think about your children reading to you, don't get caught up on reading levels. And it's
Right.
completely normal and completely okay for your kids to read a lot of books that are below their level,
Right.
because that is what strengthens their reading muscle. So books that are above your child's reading level, you read those to them. Books that are at your child's reading level as they're learning to read, those are great books for you to practice with and have them read out loud to you. But let them consume as many books as they want below their reading level, because that's going to strengthen their reading muscle and make reading enjoyable and fun to them. So that's another way to use books.
Right. And I love that, because so many times we want to see our kids excel. We want to see them doing a good job. And maybe we push them to read books that are a little bit too hard. And that takes the fun out of reading.
Yeah.
As our kids develop better reading skills, they will want to read more and more difficult books. But if we try to force those on them when they're not quite ready for it, it really does take the fun out of it. And then they don't want to read. And we want
Yeah.
them to love reading. So that's a really
Yeah,
good
for
point.
sure.
Yeah. Okay, talk to us for a minute about what about these families that have a wide range of ages to teach? How can we use books to kind of bridge that gap between maybe the younger and the older kids and do some things with them all together?
So I mentioned earlier about morning time or morning basket being this real efficient time in your school day. So my family does history during our morning basket time. So I have a 15-year-old, I have a 13-year-old, and I have a 10-year-old. And so we don't all go to separate parts of the house and have like the 15-year-old working on ancient history while the 13-year-old's working on American history and the 10-year-old working on what would be another history, Middle Ages. Okay, so that would just drive me absolutely crazy. I could not do that. And so what we all do is we all come together during our morning time and we read those history books together. And I read them aloud to the kids. And then I have different expectations of what those kids give
Right.
back to me based on the reading aloud that I've done to them. So I'm elevating my younger kid. He's getting
Right.
more. He may not get all of it. That's okay. He's probably going to get that history again before he leaves the house.
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay if he's not getting exactly everything that I'm reading. But then I'm expecting my older child to turn around and produce some kind of written narration or some kind of feedback based on that history that I'm not going to expect out of my 10-year-old. I might even expect that older child to do a little reading by themselves later on in the day. So for example, we're going to be reading the children's Homer this year in our morning basket. I'm going to be reading it aloud to the kids, but my daughter, who's in 10th grade, will also be reading the Odyssey by herself later on in the day. And so you can just add on a little bit more. So I find that reading and books, using those with your kid, combining them, just really saves me a lot of time and energy in my homeschool.
Yeah.
And you know what? Differentiated or education is like this huge buzzword. Like we've got to, meet all of the kids where they are. Homeschoolers have been doing this naturally for years.
That's right. That's right. And it works really well. It honestly does. But it's something we have to allow ourselves to do and realize that by reading that book to your kids at all these different ages, that younger kid is getting exposed to information that he might otherwise not be exposed to at all. And then maybe you don't require as much feedback from him at a younger age, but he's still processing probably a lot more information than you even, or he even realizes. So
yeah. And can I talk about like a 5-year-old for a minute? Because I just realized I gave an example of a 15, 10, and 13-year-old. Okay, so let's talk about the 5-year-old. So maybe you have the 15, 13, 10-year-old, and then maybe you've got like a 7-year-old or a 5-year-old who's tagging along. So what does that look like? Well, what that looks like is that child's just listening, and they're not providing anything back to you. They might, give, like you might say, hey, what happened in the story or something like that. And they might tell you something, but they're really not giving you anything back. And as they're listening, they're playing with Legos. They're running Matchbox cars on the floor. They're working with Play-Doh. Their perler beads and rainbow loom were huge in my house for the longest time, even though I hated picking them up off the floor.
Shrinky dinks are fun for that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes, but they're doing something with their hands. They're listening along. They're old enough that they can be expected to be quiet, but they're not just sitting there, not saying anything, not moving while you're doing this reading aloud. And that's so important. And my friend Sarah McKenzie at Read Aloud Revival, she has a great podcast where she talks about how, especially for boys, a lot of time, them actually doing something with their hands and moving while they're listening to the reading means that they're taking more in and processing it better than if they're just required to sit still.
Right. I'm so glad you mentioned that. When my kids, well, honestly, even when they were older, as I read to them, I always allowed them to do something. Obviously, it can't be something real noisy, but I allowed them to do things with their hands, because if I didn't, guess what they were doing? Poking each other, punching each other, making noise, talking out loud, squiggling and squirming. But if I allowed them to do something with their hands, they would sit there quietly. And I found through discussion that they actually remembered a lot more of what I read to them when their hands were busy.
Yep.
But those of us who grew up in a classroom or who are pulling our kids from classrooms tend to think, well, our kids aren't listening if they're doing something with their hands. And, that's just not true. It's just not.
No, it's not. It's not. And it changes as they get older. I mean, drawing is huge now for my kids. That's what they typically do while I read is draw. So. Okay.
So do you have tips? There are a lot of parents nowadays who maybe weren't expecting to homeschool and find themselves having to do it anyway. Or who have been considering homeschooling and they're down to the point where they really have to make that decision, and they may not really be sure where to find good books. Or, if you look on Amazon or at a bookstore or whatever, there are hundreds and thousands of books. How do they decide which books are the best ones to use in their homeschools?
Okay, so I've got a couple resources for you that I have prepared for this one. So one of my favorite places to get books, especially books that are really suitable for reading aloud, because there's a difference between books that are good for reading aloud and books that are good for reading for yourself. Remember, we talked earlier about the whole strewing thing.
Right.
So one of my very favorite resources is Read Aloud Family. This is by my good friend, Sarah McKenzie. She has a podcast called the Read Aloud Revival Podcast. I'll have to get her to send me a check. Because I'm like, go listen to this podcast. But this book is fabulous. There's all kinds of, so 20 favorite read alouds for ages 0 to 3 in the back, ages 8 to 11. So she's got it broken down by age. And these are good books for, look, she's even got what teens can do while you read aloud.
Oh, that's great.
So these are good books for different age groups that are perfect for reading out loud. So this is one resource. And then if you go on the website, they even have the different sets of books broken down. So they'll have like books about the Middle Ages, books about the ancient world, you know, books about books for perfect for girls or whatever. So those are some different things you could look at.
Okay.
Another resource is Timeline of the Classics. So this one is from the Institute for Excellence in Writing, IEW. And basically, it's a big chart and it goes down all through the ages. It's definitely a timeline. There are all of these books that are kind of sorted by historical period. And then they tell you, are these elementary, high school, or middle school?
Oh,
so
that's awesome.
Yeah. So this is a really good resource. You can get it printed or you can get it in a PDF. One I forgot to grab is Jamie Martin's Give Your Child the World. So this is another kind of reading list that is geography based. So she has books from Africa for elementary, middle, and high school, books from Europe for elementary, middle, and high school. So that's another great resource as well. And then if you want to know something like, well, we're doing math in our homeschool, or we're doing history, or we're doing poetry, where do I go for that? My website, we actually have a podcast. Like we'll have a podcast with a math expert. There'll be a ton of math books in there. So if you look up the Your Morning Basket podcast and find the topics that you're interested in, we typically have a little mini book list that goes along with each topic.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, so to find your podcast, can you explain to people, do they just go to the podcast app that they use on their phones or computers and type in Your Morning Basket and they can find your podcast?
Yep, that's perfect. So any podcast app that you do, you can find us in there, or you can just go to pambarnhill.com and scroll about halfway down the page and all the latest podcast episodes are there. You click and you can just go down a wormhole forever. We've got 75 episodes. So.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good. So can you take a minute and tell us, what criteria do you use for determining what's a good book? If I find a book on the shelf or want to borrow one from the library or whatever, how do I know if that's one I really want to use in my homeschool or not?
So the very first thing is, okay, this is big. Does it look interesting to you? I mean, don't let people tell you what good books are and good books aren't if you are enjoying it and your children are enjoying it. I mean, that's like the most important thing right there. And so, pick up the book, look at it. Does it look appealing to you? Read a few words inside the book. Does the language sound like, something you would want to read? Go back to, so when my daughter was 6, she would bring me the Barbie books, and I don't know where. I think we would find them at the library, or some relative gave them to us or something like that. And I just looked at her and I said, when you learn to read, you can read the Barbie books all you want to, but Mama doesn't read Barbie books. I mean, I just, and so, I mean, those were just not books that I was going to use.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have cared if anybody had said they were wonderful. There have been other books that people have said are wonderful. And I'm just like, this is a little bit of a yawn fest.
Yeah.
So I go with your gut and don't worry about finding the perfect book. Find the book that you enjoy and that speaks to you.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I know sometimes people get concerned about the books that their kids read just for fun. I remember my son went through a stage years back when he loved the Hank the Cowdog books.
Oh, I love Hank the Cowdog.
I know, they're so cute. They're so cute. My daughter actually really enjoyed them too. But I had people saying, well, I'm not going to let my kids read those because Hank, the cowdog that the book is about, kind of smarts off sometimes and has a little bit of an attitude and that sort of thing. But guess what? They made my son love to read. So it was okay with me. And so we did have some learning moments, a time or two, when he might try smarting off a little bit, like Hank the Cowdog did or whatever. So sometimes we can use those real life opportunities to teach our kids what's okay, what's not okay. um,
Yeah, I totally agree. We actually listened to Hank the Cowdog in audiobook. The author, John Erickson, reads them. He is an absolute delight. He is a lovely man. And yeah, I mean, Hank kind of has a little attitude, but that's a good lesson to learn that, look, just because you hear something in a book doesn't mean that you repeat it to somebody else.
right,
This is just because Hank takes this attitude doesn't mean that
right.
it's okay for you to take this
That's
attitude.
right.
So,
That's right. Those really were good books. We listened to some of the audios and then we read some aloud too. And then the kids read a lot of them just themselves because they
yeah,
loved them so much. And I couldn't spend, 8 hours a day just reading to my kids.
right,
So,
right.
all right. What about good books? Finding good books for students if it's a topic that you're not very familiar with.
Um, so I would go to a book list. So that's, that would be where I would start. And there are so many good book lists online. You could even, I mean, I dig down the rabbit hole on Amazon as well. I don't know if you do this.
Oh, yes.
So yeah. So if, let's say you find a book, so let's say a book on ancient Egypt for homeschooling, and you search it up on Amazon, and it's one of those that you found on a homeschool list, and you see it there, and you're like, well, I'm not sure about this one. This is just not quite us. If you go down there for customers also searched for, homeschool moms don't buy one single book,
Right.
right? So they're going to look at every single book before they make a purchase. So you're going to find an alternative that looks really good to you. So I use that feature a lot when I'm looking for books. And then of course, something like this, like a timeline of the
Right.
classics, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The book lists are out there for you. And so just find ones that resonate with you and use those a lot. So
I like those too. And I like to look at the reviews. If I'm looking a book up on Amazon, I really do like to look at the reviews, even sometimes the negative reviews, because
mhm.
sometimes it might just be, I bought this book for my 5-year-old, but it's more appropriate for a 10-year-old. Well,
Yeah.
if I have a 10-year-old or an older child, then that tells me, okay, this book is probably appropriate for my older child, even if it's not, but like we talked about earlier too, it's okay to kind of mix those, the kids of all ages and read together. So,
Yeah. 3-star
um,
reviews are usually really helpful. 3-star reviews are usually really helpful. Those are the people who are like not trashing the book, but they have something important to say. There's a reason why they didn't give it a 4 or a 5-star. So,
yeah,
and then, another thing is get to know your librarian. So
yes,
a lot of times as homeschoolers, what the librarian believes and what we believe that don't always match up. But what I
right,
have found from talking with my local librarians is that once they know where we are and what we're after, then they try to help us find what we are and what
yeah,
we're after.
yeah,
So they're not going to give us the books that don't kind of jive with our worldview or whatever the case may be. They really do want to help, and they really want to
right,
do, help everybody. And
right.
so once you build that relationship and get to know them, you don't have to be afraid of going to your local librarian and asking for help.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And even nowadays that some libraries, may not be open for people to browse in and that sort of thing. Most places you can still call and have them set aside books for you and that
Yeah.
sort of thing. And they're able to browse the shelves and kind of find books, even if you're not able to go in and look.
Yeah,
So I like
exactly.
that. All right, before we run out of time, I would like to ask you a couple more questions. What about audiobooks and e-readers? You mentioned you listened to the Hank the Cowdog audiobooks. My kids did too. So how do you feel about audiobooks and e-readers, and how do you suggest that parents use those?
So audiobooks are fabulous. I mean, there is absolutely no difference between listening to an audiobook and reading a book as far as and they've done some recent brain studies on this. I should have pulled up some information, but I've seen some articles recently where they're talking about, look, your brain is processing the information in the exact same way. It's not cheating to listen to an
Right,
audiobook. And I have a child who's dyslexic, and audiobooks have just absolutely revolutionized. uh, he did not love reading for a while. He really struggled with it. And then he got caught up in one or two series, and we use a service called Learning Ally, which they have over 80,000 audiobooks, and we pay one price per year. And then we have an Audible account on top of that for the other stuff. But so he consumes a ton of audiobooks, and it just has made all the difference. So if you have children who struggle with reading, let them listen. My kids listen before bedtime. Like they listen to audiobooks. If we go for a walk around the block, they're listening to audiobooks. Anytime we go on a family vacation, we listen to audiobooks in the car. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Do it. And then e-readers, it's just going to depend on your comfort level with that kind of thing. I have a Kindle Paperwhite, which mimics a real book. I can take it out in the sun. It's waterproof. I can take it in the bathtub. That's where I get a lot of my quiet reading done.
Yeah.
And I love it, but I used to have one of the backlit screens that had like distractions on it, like email and things like that. I didn't love that one. So, you just got to look at what's comfortable to you and your child. The other thing I love about the Kindle for me is I can make the text as big as I want to.
Exactly.
As I'm getting older.
I know. This is true.
If you have children who have vision issues or something like that, or they just need to have fewer words on the page.
Right.
Their technology does offer some advantages, not to mention, I carry it. I don't have it with me, but I carry it with me, and I've got 50 books on here.
Right.
So if I'm going on a trip, or, even kids, like if they're going on vacation or, going to dad's for the weekend or whatever, they take all their books. So,
Yeah. And to me, during times like right now, I know a lot of people aren't traveling a lot, but during times when we're traveling, I can take my just for fun book. I can take my informational book. I can take my Bible reading. I can take, I've got my news information, and I've got all that right there, so that whatever I'm in the mood for, whatever I need or want to read, I have it all on that one device. But where I really couldn't take 3 books this thick in my suitcase or on an airplane or that sort of thing. So it's kind of nice for me to have it all there on one device, so that whatever I need, I've got.
And ask your kids.
Yeah.
How do you prefer to read? Can you read like this? And a lot of times, like if I'm reading something informational, I like to have a paper book so I can highlight it. Right. I don't like to highlight in the device as much. Right. So it just depends. But your kids may be more comfortable with it than you are. And then there may be some books that your kids say, look, I would really love to have a paper book. So
Right. Yeah, I agree. And that's a good point too. Part of it might depend on the purpose of your reading, because if I'm reading in my Bible or if I'm reading in an informational book, I do want to be able to highlight and I do want to be able to make notes. But if I'm reading something just for fun, then I don't mind a bit reading that on my Kindle or my Kindle app on my phone, because I don't so much need to do the highlights and make notes and things. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question for you. Can you give us some good tips for using our local libraries? Just wherever we live, whatever our purpose is.
So definitely, like I was talking about, build a relationship with the librarian. Let them know, like, some of your family values and different things like that. And then you're going to be able to work together to, she's going to help you or he's going to help you find the books that are going to work for your family. Also, like if you're studying ancient history next year, a lot of times libraries have budgets and they're looking to buy books that their patrons are going to use. And so, speak to them and say, is there any way we can get these books? You're going to have to give them lead time, but, definitely do that, and have other homeschool families do the same. Like even if they're not studying ancient history next year, it's like, look, you might want these 2 years from now. Could you mention them too? So work with your other homeschool families. And then one of the things that I find that is often underutilized in libraries are their electronic media. So a lot of times libraries have a partnership with like Libby, or I can't remember the name of the other one, but these services where you can get Kindle books or electronic books or audio books that they're not sitting there on the shelf. but you have access to them as a library patron. And then our library has boxes you can check out. So we can check out like a world geography box or a World War II box, or there's a grammar box, which my kids are like, what? But it has all these games in there. So you could build entire unit studies just around checking out these boxes that have videos, games, activities, books, all different kinds of things. So look out for those extra special kinds of opportunities that the library has that are not just books. Libraries often hold classes. I mean, not right now, obviously, but ours will do like different handicraft classes or meet the author classes. We would go read to dogs. That was a big thing. We read to service dogs. My boys loved it. So, look at those kinds of opportunities. And even checking out things like a microscope or a telescope. A lot of times libraries offer those, and if they don't, they might be open to it.
Right.
Hey, I heard this library somewhere else had this opportunity. Do you think you could get a microscope for homeschoolers to check out? So.
Right. And two, like you said, if we have relationships with the librarians, we can ask them, okay, you know a little bit about us now. We've been in here, we kind of know each other and what we want and need. So what do you see? What do you have available that we might not even know to ask about?
Right.
Because they'll know what's there and what's available, even if we don't know to even ask the questions.
Yeah. And they're
want probably
you to
thrilled.
Use it.
Yeah.
Yes, they want you to use it. Exactly. Which
Right.
I know all of that goes beyond books, but but yeah, it's important to utilize all those resources.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, if you would like to tell us one more time real quickly how to find you on your podcast and your website, anything else you want us to know maybe that I didn't ask you about?
Yeah. So go to pambarnhill.com. And there we have the podcast, which is all about Morning Basket. I also have a book called Better Together, which is Strengthen Your Family, Simplify Your Homeschool, and Savor the Subjects That Matter Most. This is all about your entire family learning together, making your homeschool life easier. You can find us on the podcast app. And we also help moms with homeschool planning as well. So if you're a little bit overwhelmed with this idea of how do I plan, check out freehomeschoolplanner.com, and we have some information there.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so very much. It was just nice to see you. It was nice to chat with you. You gave us some great information. I'm excited to share this with our moms, and it was just nice to chat for a little while.
It was nice to chat. So I miss you.
I know. I miss you too. It was good to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this for us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Wendy.
And I will talk to you hopefully soon.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Pam. All right. Bye.